In this video, we'll be covering the importance and history of regulating medical devices. Our learning objectives are to understand why regulatory oversight is essential to ensuring consumer safety, to know the history of medical device regulations in the FDA, and to know the primary concerns of the FDA in evaluating medical devices. To start with, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what the world is like if there are no regulations. And to do this, I'm going to share a story with you that I read in the Wall Street Journal. So the title of the article was "The Radium Water Worked Fine Until His Jaw Came Off." So it's a very striking, eye-catching title, right? Well, this article was about a guy named Eben Byers, who was a wealthy socialite in the 1920s. And he was an enthusiast of this product called Radithor. But his testimony actually led to it being pulled off the market. And here you can see the newspaper clipping after his death. So this guy, he was a wealthy socialite, as I said, and he started drinking this radium-laced water because he thought that it was a magical elixir. So he was kind of duped by the people selling it. And he started taking it, I believe it was after a rugby injury to his shoulder. He drank a couple bottles, felt great, so then he started drinking it all the time and sharing it with all of his friends. And eventually, of course, he got radiation poisoning, and his body was so radioactive that he had to be buried in a lead casket. But he wasn't the only person who bought into this. So Radithor, it was a thing, it was a product that people were buying because they were inspired by the mild radioactivity of hot springs. So they thought that hot springs had these magical healing abilities. They thought it was linked to the radioactivity. But then they thought, oh, well, they lose their radioactivity after a few days. So we need to modify this water. We need to add radium. And so the rationale was that the water had gone flat and could be recharged. So Radithor was one product out there. I actually saw some of this in Houston a few months ago. There was an exhibit called Death by Natural Causes at the museum there. And I got to see a little bottle of Radithor, which was pretty cool. But people also had these jars called Revigators in their home that would infuse their drinking water with radioactivity. There were also suppositories, which if you don't know what a suppository is, you can go and look that up. But there were suppositories that people could buy that were radioactive. But of course, this is a bad thing, and a lot of people got very sick and died from these things. And it was all because there was a lack of oversight. There was nobody who was vetting these products to ensure that they were safe before people started putting them into their bodies. For better or worse, tragedies have a way of stimulating change, and we see that actually with legislation that pertains to medical devices that predates even that story that I just told you about. So this is the Biologics Control Act of 1902, which was really the first modern legislation to control the quality of drugs. The purpose of it was to regulate the sale of viruses, serums, toxins, and analogous products. And it emerged in response to a tragedy. So in 1901 in St. Louis and Camden, there were these contamination events related to unregulated diphtheria antitoxin. So it was a tetanus outbreak that the products were contaminated with because, again, there was no oversight. And then, so this article at the bottom, this is from the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was published in 2001. But here you can see they're showing an excerpt from an article in 1901 talking about this unjustifiable distrust in the diphtheria antitoxin. And if you read the text, you can kind of see a little bit of what was going on at the time. So after this tetanus outbreak, if we look there, so they mention an increase in 1/3 of the case mortality of diphtheria since the first month is attributed to the growing distrust of the antitoxin. And they say that the medical inspectors and antitoxin administrators of the department report that parents refuse to allow the use of the antitoxin unless the physician will pledge himself that the serum is perfectly pure and free from any danger of causing tetanus. So rightfully so, the parents were concerned. But the problem here, they say, is a 33% increase in the case mortality of such a tractable or treatable disease as diphtheria under the antitoxin treatment within less than 3 weeks is too serious a matter to be dismissed. So there needed to be a better way that they could guarantee patients' safety, but then still, give this antitoxin to treat diphtheria, because diphtheria was, of course, a very serious problem. So the Biologics Control Act of 1902 served to do this. The next milestone was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So the purpose of this legislation was to prevent the manufacture, sale, or transportation of adulterated or misbranded or poisonous or deleterious foods, drugs, and medicines, so things that were harmful. And a catalyst for this was actually the exposure of health violations and unsanitary practices in the American meatpacking industry, which were detailed in this book, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So this was in response to these problems. And then there was also the Shirley Amendment in 1912, which was related to this, which prohibited false and fraudulent labeling of a product. So kind of now we're getting at some of the problems with that, the Radiathor and the other similar products. But at this point, note that medical devices were not considered, because medical devices weren't really yet a thing. So this is just pertaining to foods, drugs, medicines, and liquors. But what's important about this piece of legislation is that it gave unprecedented new regulatory powers to the federal government, and it actually empowered a bureau within the government that evolved into what became the FDA that we know today. Now, some time passed before we got to the next major milestone. That didn't come until 1938, and this was the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So this extended the control to cosmetics and now therapeutic devices. And it also required that new drugs had to be shown to be safe before marketing could begin. So this kind of ushered in a new system of drug regulation, and this is more similar now to what we have today. And it eliminated a requirement of the Shirley Amendment, which was to prove intent to defraud in drug misbranding cases. So now that intent's gone, and you can be held liable even if you didn't mean to defraud a consumer. It also provided that safe tolerances be set for unavoidable or poisonous substances. So this could be like chemicals that might be present as a consequence of the manufacturing. And then it authorized standards of identity, quality, and fill of container for foods. Again, just making sure that things are what they say they are. And then authorized factory inspections so that the regulatory agency could check in on the manufacturers. And then lastly, it added the remedy of court injunctions to the previous penalties. And this was all important because now what we see is the FDA has been charged with removing adulterated or misbranded medical devices from the market. However, it didn't give the agency the authority to review medical devices before going yet. So that did not come until later on. So in 1969, President Nixon called for certain minimum standards for medical devices. And then there was also the Cooper Report in 1970. And all of this contributed to the Medical Device Amendments of 1976. So here, again, tragedy was what spurred this action. So this was in response to more than 700 deaths and 10,000 injuries being reported that were associated with medical devices. So there were 512 deaths and injuries associated with heart valves that were being implanted in patients, 89 deaths and 186 injuries related to cardiac pacemakers, and 10 deaths and 8,000 injuries related to intrauterine devices for contraception. So here the call was that the government should be given additional authority to require pre-marketing clearance in the cases of medical devices. So the Cooper Committee reviewed this in the 70s, and they made recommendations that were debated in Congress until 72 and 73. So additional pacemaker failures were reported during this time. And then in 1975, hearings took place related to the Dalkon Shield intrauterine device, which caused thousands of injuries. In all of these incidents, they underscored this need for regulation. So there's this recognition that something needed to be done to protect consumers. And so finally, in 1976, the medical device amendments were passed. And here we see the language that now becomes very familiar for the FDA. So the purpose was to ensure safety and effectiveness, or safety and efficacy of medical devices, including diagnostic products. So safety and efficacy, those are the two utmost concerns of the FDA when they're reviewing medical devices. The amendments also required manufacturers to register with the FDA and follow quality control procedures. And then they introduced this concept of pre-market approval. So if you're interested in learning more about the history of medical device regulations in the FDA, you can check out this article, which I'm going to post to eCampus. Now I'm just going to hit some of the highlights since 1976. So there was the Safe Medical Devices Act of 1990. This instituted a new requirement to report incidents to the FDA that suggest that a medical device probably caused or contributed to death, illness, or injury of a patient. So this is, reporting adverse events. Then manufacturers were also required to conduct post-market surveillance, so looking for these adverse events. And then it authorized the FDA to order device product recalls. So the FDA maintains a database of adverse events that have been reported, as well as a list of device recalls, which you can see on their website. So let's go there now. So here we are on the FDA's website. Now we'll just scroll down here and click on medical devices under products we regulate. Now here, there's a lot of information, of course. We can look now to navigate the medical device section. We want to look at medical device safety. And so now here, you can see this a little bit on reporting, right, which we just mentioned before. But what I want to show you here is the medical device recalls. So now they organize it by year. You can skim a little bit here, but let's look at 2020 and see what's been recalled lately. So here at the top of the list, we have this Boston Scientific Imager 2 angiographic catheters. They've been recalled due to tip detachment. And then there are many other ones down here. So let's click on this top one. We can read a bit more about it. So you see here, it's the Imager 2 5F angiographic catheter. It says use of these devices may cause serious injuries or death. They have some affected lot numbers here. Talk about its device use for delivering contrast agent to blood vessels, including carotid arteries. And then it's been recalled because there's a potential for the catheter tip to become detached during a procedure, which would of course be very dangerous. So say there's also a potential for serious adverse events, including obstruction of blood flow, or embolism, stroke, or death. And then there have been 9 reported injuries. So this is just one example. You can find this for all recalls on the FDA's website. Again, you can also, if you search around, you can navigate to a database of the adverse events. So it's called the MAUDE database. You can also find information on recent device approvals, which is something I'll have you do as an exercise later this week. So in 1996, the FDA published a quality system regulation which revised good manufacturing practices by adding design control requirements. So if you're interested in a career in industry, one of the career options available to you is in quality assurance. So if you go that route, you'll become very familiar with this and good manufacturing practices. But I mention it here because the reason this was done is that it was estimated that nearly half of the approximately 1,200 device product recalls that were conducted annually were due to device designs. So the thought is that adherence to these good manufacturing practices could mitigate some of this and help protect consumers. Next, in 2002, the Office of Combination Products was formed. And this was done because it was necessary to oversee the review of products that fall into multiple jurisdictions within the FDA. So this was kind of a nod to the increasing complexity. And so what we're talking about here is now we don't have just devices or just materials. A lot of products that we're trying to get to market have biologic components with them. So they're materials and also biologics together. So this was really born out of a need to modernize the way that these products were being reviewed. The most recent iteration of medical device regulation that we have is the 21st Century Cures Act, which was passed in December of 2016. And this was passed to help accelerate medical product development and bring new innovations. And really a lot of this is also about some of these riskier combination type products. So big picture wise though, it was done to enhance our ability to modernize clinical trial designs and outcome assessments. So here we see speeding the development and review of these novel medical products. And also it established new and expedited product development programs. So one is this RMAT, or Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapies, that offer expedited review for biologic products. So this is very relevant to tissue engineering. So some of the products that are trying to get to market are going through this RMAT pathway. There's also the Breakthrough Devices Program, which was, again, designed to speed review of innovative medical devices. So maybe it's not a tissue engineered device, but it's very high impact type work. And lastly, this 21st Century Cures Act directed the FDA to create intercenter institutes to coordinate activities in major disease areas. And so again, they were improving the regulation of these combination products. So here I've got one example of something that has received the RMAT designation. So this is a product from Humacyte, which was a startup company actually spun out of academics, out of research at Duke University, I believe. And they have this product, Humacyl, which is a vascular graft for hemodialysis. And here you can read a little bit about it, but they say they got the RMAT designation again, which helped expedite this and get it to the market. So I'm not going to show you this video. You can go and check it out on your own if you're interested in Humacyte's work. But the point, or the need that they're addressing, is they wanted to have an off-the-shelf bioengineered vessel. So it's acellular, but they wanted to replace a patient's vessel or create a new vascular access. So this was where the hemodialysis application comes in. So these, actually the devices, they were tissue engineering a vessel and then growing it in a bioreactor, and then they decellularize it so they can store it on the shelf, and then it can be implanted in a patient and recellularized. So this is a really great example of the type of technology that has been approved through this RMAT pathway. So that concludes this lecture video. In the next videos, we'll be talking about the traditional pathways to medical device approval by the FDA, as well as the importance of adhering to standardized test methods in biocompatibility assessment.